All right, welcome to the reading of Chapter 1 of Propaganda. It's called Organizing Chaos is the title of Chapter 1. We'll do a little brief skit over Mr. Bernays. He's got a really big, long history that you could read about, so just try to get to the point so that we can get on with this. But as said, his uncle was Sigmund Freud, and Uncle Siggy played a huge influence in his life. It was like all by proxy and luck that he was able to become a student of one of the greatest psychologists sort of known in history right now. And he took to it, and so he got all those lessons for free from Uncle Siggy. So he was able to take everything that he learned from him, basically dividing group psychology and individual psychology, and understanding that with group psychology, you could guide the masses of people when you started to understand what made them tick. What does the person need in order to be motivated to accept what you want? So he also became a journalist. That was one of his first major jobs, even though it wasn't what he majored in. He decided journalism should be his first job. So it was kind of the merging of the journalism and hanging out with Uncle Siggy that brought him to his conclusion on the need for propaganda to run society in a manner that seems fit. Not just local politics, but also geopolitical. And of course, these methods, because they're all based on the human organ called the brain, you can apply them to anything that you want. So sales, of course, business, it works on everything. So that's why it's important for people to know this. When you start to get to know this stuff, you'll get to know yourself more. And the more you get to know yourself, you'll be able to ask yourself, am I being actually controlled by anybody? Am I really doing what I think I should be doing in order to live in a peaceful world, or a world that I want to live in? So so that's what a lot of this information is designed to get people to ask and uncover themselves, try to make a positive change in the world, because I think everybody can see that things are getting pretty negative right now. Okay, so one of the things that he learned was that unlocking the group psychology was critical, and if you could use it to control a group, you could control society. So the thing I see right now is that the creation of all the different groups, tribal identities in society, now there's more vehicles in which you can steer the public with public opinion. You've already got the group established. Now you can use the psychology to maneuver it to your target. So uses media and politics with charismatic leaders typically. So charismatic leaders come in handy because oftentimes maybe the truth is boring, and if you seek to motivate people into what you think is right, then you will need someone charismatic to help guide them towards that. So we see that, of course, used all over the place. You have figureheads in media, you have figureheads in politics, and then you also have celebrities coming in to weigh in what they think, because everyone should think that whatever a celebrity thinks has to be right and true because they only play heroes and whatnot, right? So that's all ways to brainwash and manipulate people. Now, in the issue of the tribe itself has always been a means of survival. And so as more tribes rise up, say with their own message and ideals that's conflicting with the other people that are in the area, it will cause more tribes to rise up against those tribes. So it becomes a cyclical pattern, and it's predictable. And because it's predictable, you can control it. So if anyone's ever heard of controlled opposition, this is how it happens, I think. So what else can we say? One of the other major motivating factors with the growth and the birth of a tribe is that the bigger it gets, and of course being in contest with what other people think, the need becomes even more substantial to try to rise up with a tribe of your own to meet it and defeat it. So the competition factor and everything will mean that there's always some sort of tribalization available through that, if that becomes the status quo or maintains itself as the status quo. So now, all the different groups that are available always end up coming with a contrary group to it, and you end up with layers of groups. And then I would also say that depending on your political alignment, your group may or may not agree with necessarily the politics that are going on, and they may or may not agree with other people that are also slotted into whatever their alignment is. So left-wing groups we can talk about would be like SJWs, is kind of a self-identifying group, various feminist groups, pro-abortion groups, which kind of aligns itself with feminism, and you have alphabet people, and then you have Black Lives Matter as a non-extreme version, people who just protest, and then it also ends up having an extreme version where people who align under that banner also take part in extreme statements and actions. So there's actually a split even within that group. So multiple fractioning. It's just chaotic, right? So, and then another group that aligns itself with the left, because what the left seeks to do is to give everyone rights. And so everyone who figures they need rights will flock to that, because there's only two major choices. So you either align with that or you align with the one that's maybe not interested in giving you extra rights, because the other side is supposed to, at least in theory, provide everyone their base rights, sort of based on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, even though that's specifically an American doctrine, a lot of other nations like to draw on that, because they can intrinsically, people who know it, see how important that is to your freedom. That's exactly what that doctrine was about. That doctrine and the actions that happened around that doctrine to make it take place, to me, historically, is the first time that man was able to really break free of authority. But as we see cycles through time, authority sort of has replaced the concept of freedom within it. But at any rate, that's kind of the fundamental conservative view. So everyone should be able to just align under that, and not be treated badly for their beliefs, religion, race, sex, etc. Okay, so that's fair. And then the other side is, like I say, you have groups who figure that they're not being given a fair shake under the same basic rights, and so they need help. So that's the boost, and that's why you'll have groups that are intersectional as well as individual, of those intersectionalities, as well as other groups involved that don't agree with those same groups. So they might unite at times for the political purposes of it, but some of these groups will ultimately, if they ever got so big that everything was their way, they would get rid of all the other groups that are participating with them for their liberty. They will only want liberty for themselves and their way of things to be done. So there's a major fractioning on the left that cannot be helped. When Obama comes out and says you need to stop the circular firing squad, it is impossible, because all of the groups essentially are religions, and you can't go against the beliefs of the group. And so those groups will at all times be water and oil to each other. Some of them will blend, some of them won't. You might get emulsions, but sometimes nope. You're just never going to have continuum or homogeny in those groups. So being a constitutionalist and a Republican gets you away from all of that, and you can unite everybody under that. So we can see that left-wing politics has really become the destructive one to everyone's true freedom. And they believe that they're fighting for freedom, but the actuality is that in order to get it, they have to ask for more government. Government has to provide their freedom. These discoveries are actually important in this regard. So there's 4 kinds of people you need to appeal to according to Bernays and Freud. So you have to appeal to people's need for authority, if that appeals to them, reason, persuasion, or tradition. And so to me, when I was looking at all of those, although those can exist in both groups and do to some degree, there's prominent ones in each group for the left-right political paradigm that we've been sort of placed into. And I find that the appeal to authority and persuasion is mostly on the left wing. So the left wing will use persuasive techniques such as emotionally goading words, verbiage, and propaganda through media to emotionally guide people onto their side. We are the heroes. We'll make you feel really bad about the other side, that they're evil, and then you'll automatically come to us to be the heroes. So it's all emotionally based, and facts don't matter. That's why facts don't matter. The strength of the group has to survive amongst the threat, the facts. And since the facts aren't part of their religious doctrine, they won't even go down that road. They just avoid it, right? So, okay, so they have the need for authority in order to provide them those rights. So that's where the authority aspect comes in, is that they have to all go flock to that political center in order to get what they think that they need in life that they don't think that they're already getting. And if they aren't getting that thing already, maybe it's justifiable, maybe it isn't. But that's something that, we do work on and decide through, sometimes decades in a court of law, but it's something that always seems to come to a conclusion, whether it be same-sex marriage or should people be allowed to have one of the drugs that have been scheduled for non-consumption, so cannabis, right? I mean, that's kind of the one that's been fought for a really long time, is finally starting to be allowed. The people are finally allowed to have a plant. So some things are good, some things are bad when it comes to that. But authority always times either gives it to you or gets in the way, and either way, you belong to that authority. You haven't stated, I belong to myself and I'll decide, thanks. So that's one of the bigger things that we have to focus on too, is our individuality, in order to separate ourselves from the belief systems that we've been given that will always end up holding us having to a position of holding contrary beliefs. Our logic will be submitted to on one side, and our emotions will be on the other side. So when the emotional side kicks in, that's when the propaganda really greases the wheel and just makes you go wherever it wants to. And so conservative beliefs end up being more to do with reason and traditionalism. So to me, the traditionalism would be one of the main ones, is really any doctrine to do with freedom. So really, again, the Constitution is the spirit of the tradition, that we have this doctrine of freedom, and that's what we want. That's our tradition. Our tradition is freedom. And anybody else around the world who understands that, like I say, they're happy to try to adopt the U.S. Constitution. Many countries have asked for help directly from the United States to come and free them from the authority that they're under, because that's, like I said, what they became known for. They were the fourth servile rebellion, so to speak. I guess Spartacus had it way back yonder. And then, this become the next biggest one that caused change. I mean, obviously that's not true. The French Revolution was in there too. But I mean, this is another servile rebellion, and it's turned into a nation. And the nation is currently trying to go back against that rebellion and replace it with its own methodology. So, at any rate, true constitutionalists, that's their tradition, is to try to maintain equality and individual freedom. And it's done all through systems of reason. And it's also what they use to stand against the emotional side on, is that they conflict reason against emotion. I don't know how true it is, but I think that, left versus right-brained people might have something to do with this too. So if you're left-brained, they say you're more logical and everything comes out of your right hand. So writing, logic, left-brained. Artists, there's a relatively good percentage of artists that are left-handed apparently, so that's supposed to be your creative side. So the right side of your brain goes through your left hand, and you're more creative, you're more artistic, you're more think outside the box. You go into places where you can create a logical structure of something, even though it's intangible. So there's just different people, and I mean, those people they're actually both beneficial to society, but it's not so beneficial when you pit them against each other, right? So at any rate, that's maybe how I look at the left-right thing a little bit too, is that it has to do with your own chemistry, maybe. To talk about the groups that are involved to some degree, so right-wing groups are a little bit different. They don't all have to flock together in order to get what they want through the body politic as much. Some are maybe believing in the Constitution and others aren't, but they already have schisms too. Well, I guess both do, but so I mean, let's talk about right-wing groups. So Boogaloo Boys are one that's kind of prominent right now. Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer kind of aligns with all that stuff. MGTOW, pro-life groups, which can be both, not extreme and extreme, depends on how things get going. So some groups are more centrist than they are extremist. And some of the extremist groups that I guess you could say that exist, that, there's appeals that are sought out for, would be like the KKK, um, which is an interesting one because there's only 5 to 8,000 of them, and I don't really see them really doing very much these days. Although there's actually a really good documentary you can go watch. I'll put it in the description from a channel called Soft White Underbelly, and he interviews Grand Wizard and how the Grand Wizard feels about things right now. So that's definitely something interesting to look at and pay attention to. That, as I said, as a group rises and becomes more and more powerful, if another group feels threatened by it, they're forced to either grow themselves or eventually be extinguished. So we are going to see more group activity as this escalates, if it doesn't start to de-escalate at some point. And with the election still coming up in November, I would suggest that there's no reasonable assumption that things are going to de-escalate at all. So honestly, I'd say it would de-escalate more if the left wins. If Biden were to get in, I think things would actually have a chance at potentially de-escalating just a little bit more, because I believe conservative people aren't going to go and riot and cause destruction over it. They'll just sort of be like, okay, well, we better dig in ourselves as people and just kind of live in the world that people have chosen for us right now. So, but I mean, it's pretty clear to see that the left extreme groups are far more active right now. Obviously, anybody paying attention. So, what else do you end up with extremist groups on the right? Well, I don't know. Say like the Westboro Baptists and Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys, all that stuff. They're not going to align with the Klan. They're not going to align with any MCs. They're not going to align with the Westboro group, most likely. Those groups have friction to the point where they don't ever want to be associated with each other to get their rights from the government. Whereas, like, there's a huge chunk of groups on the left that, even though they are contradictory to each other, they're still willing to try to align themselves in order to get their political goals met. So those are some interesting differences between left and right wing groups that exist psychologically. What can we talk about now? So people have a rational side and an egotistical side. Now, the rational side is the part of you that will think things through and then make the decision based on what you believe to be true. But we also all have an egotistical side because we come with emotions. And so the egotistical side, it will, against its own logical will, or your logical will, the egotistical side will push you into places where your emotional needs are being met. And that is what is capitalized on with propaganda. It gets into your emotions and then it uses them to guide you towards its target, right? So it becomes that all groups can be manipulated. So if you belong to any group, there'll be some manipulation because there'll be some thoughts that you don't agree with, or you'll have your own thoughts, but they won't be allowed. So in order to rise up and as a tribe to fight the other tribe, you have to forego some of your own thoughts sometimes. And then thus the only escape is for people to try to destroy their ego. So there's a lot of spiritual work that exists, and even psychological work. So like maybe some of the work that Jordan Peterson does, although it's not rooted in spirituality, it might contain a certain amount of it so that it tries to get you to be a better person for society, better person for your family. So, I mean, there's different methods out there that you can find to try to destroy the ego. Buddhism is a spiritual way of doing it. There's spiritual ways to do it in Christianity. There probably is in Islam as well. Whether or not those things get focused on within those groups, though, is the problem. So, again, you might have to take it on yourself and only find the truths that when you read them, you kind of tingle off of it. Like, that's the true shit. Anything that basically tells you that causing some sort of harm is necessary, then you're being misled. The only time you should ever have to cause anybody harm is if they're trying to harm you. So that's the golden rule, right? So you have to destroy that ego. So, like, how do you do that? I mean, most people don't have it in them to do it because they feel strong in their groups, and so they won't separate from those groups. But that's ultimately what you have to do, is that you have to be able to escape the group and thus the group mentality. Um, if you can do that, slay the dragon, slay the ego, slay the beast, then you'll be free of all those systems that they are um, appealing to, right? You won't find yourself aligning with something if it has one single thing that you don't agree with. You won't align to that belief structure that you have to believe in order to belong to a group. Um, the beast system, as it's written in some doctrine, is potentially just a system that's driven by ego. Maybe that's all the beast means. The beast inside of you. If everyone is dominated by the beast inside of them instead of the true self inside of them, then you see what you get. Everybody's constantly trying to devour each other, and the beast is constantly trying to, as a bigger unit, devour the other bigger unit. So that's what we have to get away from. And so a quote from Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche sort of as an inspirational to help you maybe think about the separation of the group and what it's like. He says, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you'll be lonely, often, and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." So that was Nietzsche with his thoughts on it, the individual versus the group. So that's my introductory. It's already way longer than I thought it would be, but that's okay. We're doing a book learning, and hopefully this is interesting and people are still listening. So, well, here we go. Step into the first chapter of propaganda, which is organized chaos. Organizing chaos. Should have the page ready. Here we go. So, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. And it's funny that he says it like that, because this is one of the guys who was one of the invisibles who helped start teaching the few how to govern the many. So he always seems to try to remove himself from the things that happen with the information that he gives the world, because sometimes maybe it's used for a better purpose than not. Sometimes propaganda could be used to try to attain a benevolent direction. I suppose you could say that if the moral side starts to use propaganda, it might be a case of you've poked me, I've shoved you, you've slapped me, I've punched you, you've kicked me in the shin, I've kicked you in the reproductive parts. And so the use of propaganda might even be necessary in order to try to maintain values of freedom. But ultimately, again, you don't actually need that. If you know what the values of freedom are and you just cling to them as a person, you don't really need the group. But if there's a whole bunch of individuals in a group, that's a different thing. That's should be the end goal, is to have a whole bunch of individual free thinkers who work together like scientists trying to figure things out, no matter what that problem is, whether it's in your neighborhood or your world. So this is a logical result of the way in which democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. And he might actually be right on that, despite all of my criticism of it. In order to have a smoothly functioning society where you've kind of got sort of a Babylon going on, where you are attempting to rule multiple people with different beliefs, but to unite them under one common belief structure in order to keep them from fighting as much. So there could be some truth to that. Our individual governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. And the reason why I believe that is because you don't want them starting to either perhaps coerce together or to start maybe having a disagreement. Maybe they have different roles to fill, and so they're not allowed to know about each other so that they don't start talking and taking the train off track. They govern us by their qualities of natural leadership, their ability to supply needed ideas, and by their key position in the social structure. Whatever attitude one chooses towards this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons, a trifling fraction of our 120 million. So, like I said, this is written in 1928ish. So, now it's 350 million in the United States. And these people understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, the small governing the few. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. So the old social forces would be, I would suggest, all of the old rulers that are still the ones who still had wealth and power and influence, and despite the rebellion and the search for freedom and to guard it and hold it, there's still old world forces that are trying to organize things the way they should be organized. They think they should be organized. So, and new ways to bind and guide the world. So, of course, they're always growing and developing new techniques, which is part of what this is. It is not usually realized how necessary these invisible governors are to the orderly functioning of our group life. In theory, every citizen may vote for whom he pleases. Our Constitution does not envisage political parties as part of the mechanism of government, meaning that the forefathers never drew out democracy as part of the way government needed to function. And he goes on to say, and its framers seem to have not pictured to themselves the existence in our national politics of anything like the modern political machine. It was never designed to be in there, I don't think. But the American voters soon found out that without organization and direction of their individual votes, cast perhaps for dozens of hundreds of candidates, would produce nothing but confusion. Invisible government in the shape of rudimentary political parties, which is your basic left versus right, that's kind of the rudimentary, and why it appeals to people of reason and tradition, and then the other side appeals to authority and persuasion. So, I mean, it's already in your psychology. It just had to be given a harness and a chute to guide it through. The shape of rudimentary political parties arose almost overnight. So ever since then, we have agreed, for the sake of simplicity and practicality, that party machines should narrow down the field of choice to 2 candidates, or at most 3 or 4. So, of course, that absolutely resonates with democracy. You don't see more than 2 usually, and at most 3 or 4 running for your approval. What was I going to say? It's almost like practical propaganda reading this. Like, I mean, he's almost telling you what you should be expecting, and this is how you should respond to it. So there's propaganda within the book of propaganda if you sort of listen to what they're saying. And when he says that ever since we have agreed, I mean, that's true. We do agree to this system, but mainly it's a tacit agreement because we're taught that this is the way things are. And it doesn't actually mean that we agree with it. It just means that we haven't fully disagreed with it. So it's a tacit agreement, unspoken agreement. In theory, every citizen makes up his mind on public questions and matters of private conduct. In practice, if all men had to study for themselves the abstruse economic, political, and ethical data involved in every question, they would find it impossible to come to a conclusion without anything. We have voluntarily agreed to let an invisible government sift the data and high spot out the outstanding issues so that our field of choice shall be narrowed to practical proportions. From our leaders in the media they use to reach the public, we accept the evidence and the demarcation of issues bearing upon public questions from some ethical teacher, whether it be a minister, a favorite essayist, or merely prevailing opinion, the majority. We accept the standardized code of social conduct which we conform to most of the time. Interesting. So in theory, everybody buys the best and cheapest commodities offered him on the market. In practice, if everyone went around pricing and chemically tasting before purchasing the dozens of soaps or fabrics or brands of bread which are for sale, economic life would be hopelessly jammed. To avoid such confusion, society consents to have its choice narrowed to ideas and objects brought to its attention through propaganda of all kinds. And so it's basically stating that through Celebrities, slogans, media, commercials. You are told what the best of everything is, and so you get to decide between the two best things or three best things if there is that many. And although he says that we have voluntarily agreed to let an invisible government sift the data and high spot the outstanding issue, that was more true in 1928 than it is now, because with the advent of the internet and all of the information that's available through it, you see a lot of people who are trying to find other options and to discover what's really going on, to try to sift through the propaganda and the important issues themselves. And so that is the struggle that we're actually in right now, is that people are trying to use information to combat authority. It might have been better to have, instead of propaganda and special pleading, committees of wise men who would choose our rulers, dictate our conduct, private and public, and decide upon the best types of clothes for us to wear and the best kinds of food for us to eat. So I mean, that kind of sounds like communism. He seems to think it might have been better to have communism where the few decide for the many. And then he redirects us by saying, but we have chosen the opposite method, that of open competition. And that remains because people refuse to give in to authority running their lives. So that has to remain constant. We must find a way to make free competition function with reasonable smoothness. So the use of government still has to intervene in order to try to at least streamline the goal of running society in their mind and their vision. To achieve this, society has consented to permit free competition to be organized by leadership and propaganda. And so what ends up actually happening is he's redirected the wise men who choose our rulers and dictate our conduct as a small group for the group, and instead that they've been redistributed amongst society's leaders and figureheads. And so they become the few that govern the many instead. And so it has a more open feel and a more open freedom to it. There's some more mobility in it, which does create a more cohesive society. I'm not going to argue that our society isn't a decent one to live in compared to other societies, but it could be under threat right now. Because government is also at a continuous growth, and as they each grow so big, eventually that has to come to some kind of a head, which I believe we're seeing right now. Some of the phenomena of this process are criticized: the manipulation of news, the inflation of personality, and the general ballyhoo by which politicians and commercial products and social ideas are brought to the consciousness of the masses. So ballyhoo is an old word that came to being in the 19th century at some point, and there's no etymological origin for it, but basically what it means is to dramatically whoop up an issue in order to try to guide people into what you want to have happen. So being from Alberta, one that came to my mind when I read that was when Leonardo DiCaprio was here filming the biography of Hugh Glass in that movie where he fights the bear or whatever. We have a Chinook come rolling through in the middle of winter, and so it's like this prime opportunity to emotionally goad people who trust DiCaprio into believing that CO2 and man-made climate change is imminently here and it's destroying the world. So he sort of fans that off, and he doesn't hint at what a Chinook actually is, and that's an old word that has been used to eventually describe, always describe, like the warm air phenomena that comes off of the west coast and sometimes makes its all the way over the Rocky Mountains and into the prairies. So I mean, he took a natural phenomena and he used a whole bunch of words and what he thought about it to try to whoop up people that are in favor of combating climate change. So there's some ballyhoo for you that I thought of when I read that. The instruments by which public opinion is organized and focused may be misused. Such an organization and focusing are necessary to orderly life. As civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. So even there, he's suggesting that there is a need for invisible government. And I don't know if that's true or not, really. With the printing press and the newspaper, the railroad, the telephone, telegraph, radio, and airplanes, ideas can be spread rapidly and even instantaneously all over the whole of America, and now the whole world. So H.G. Wells senses the vast potentialities of these inventions when he writes in the New York Times, quote, "Modern means of communication, the power to afford by print, telephone, wireless, and so forth, of rapidly putting through directive strategic or technical conceptions to a great number of cooperating centers, of getting quick replies and effective discussion, have opened up a new world of political processes. Ideas and phrases can now be given an effectiveness greater than the effectiveness of any personality and stronger than any sectional interest. The common design can be documented and sustained against perversion and betrayal. It can be elaborated and developed steadily and widely without personal, local, and sectional misunderstanding." I guess meaning that the use of mass media and the ability to sustain your mission statement throughout all media across vast area, and now, like I say, whole world, means that you don't really have to worry as much about someone trying to give a false message about what you say or what you do. And the leadership and all that just becomes less necessary too, I suppose, because the message itself is out there and it exists across, everyone can go find it. So what Mr. Wells says of political processes is equally true of commercial and social processes and all manifestations of mass activity. The groupings and affiliations of society today are no longer subject to local and sectional limitations. When the Constitution was adopted, the unit of organization was the village community, which produced the greater part of its own necessary commodities and generated its group ideas and opinions by personal contact and discussion amongst its citizens, meaning that there's no need to have any bigger government than as far as you can see or travel. So all municipalities were really their main government. And I would suggest that although he calls that the base unit, and it's true that it is, the bigger units to grow out of that is when you have a whole bunch of these smaller communities that are all linked and work together. They can take up a bigger space, and then that can become the state. And so the states were supposed to be designed for everyone to sort of have a place to go that matched their cultural values and beliefs. And so that's the expansion of the unit into the state. And then all those states are supposed to have their rights looked after by the federal government only if needed. And so we can see a dilution of that original goal as well, where the federal government also now comes in and decides it knows what's better for the state. So that's one of the major challenges the United States needs to overcome right now if they're going to return to what they're supposed to be. But today, because ideas can be instantaneously transmitted to any distance and to any number of people, this geographical integration has been supplemented by many other kinds of grouping, so that persons having the same ideas and interests may be associated and regimented for common action, even though they live thousands of miles apart. And so one good example of that is that even though the whole Black Lives Matter thing came out of a problem that should be only being addressed within the United States, it's something that's spread around the whole world. So even places like the United Kingdom, where they don't really seem to have anywhere near that problem because their cops don't carry guns at all, so no one's really getting shot. Even they are taking part in what started as a claim of systemic racism, and it's now expanded into, we have to destroy everything to do with that system and start over, which is why they're all Marxist, and that's why they do that. That's the Marxist way of getting its way in. It has to start from a year zero, and then it becomes the only power through the generations of people that are under it. It is extremely difficult to realize how many and diverse are these cleavages in our society. They may be social, political, economical, racial, religious, or ethical, and hundreds of subdivisions of each. In the World Almanac, for example, the following groups are listed under the A's: the League to Abolish Capital Punishment, the Association to Abolish War, American Institute of Accountants, Actors, Equity Association, Actuarial Association of America, International Advertising Association, National Aeronautic Association, which later becomes the National Aeronautic Space Association, Albany Institute of History and Art, the Amen Corner, American Academy in Rome, American Antiquarian Society, League for American Citizenship, American Federation of Labor, AMORC, which is the Rosicrucian order, um, which is like kind of like an occult system. I mean, you have to join through a process, and even though they aren't active, their job as a society is to try to catalog history and create libraries. So there's them in there. Still a society today. And the Andarian Club, Anti-Irish Historical Association, Anti-Cigarette League, Anti-Profanity League, don't you swear, Archaeological Association of America, the National Archery Association, the Aryan Singing Society, American Astronomical Association, the Ayrshire Breeders Association, Aztec Club of 1847, and of course there are many more under the A section of this very limited list, and that's, you already listed tons, and by today there's way more. The American Annual and Directory for 1928 lists 22,128 periodical publications in America. God knows how many there are now because of the internet. There's probably a million publications available in America. Well, maybe not that many, 22,000. It'd be in the hundreds of thousands anyway. I have selected at random the ends published in Chicago. They are Narod, which is the Bohemian daily newspaper, Narod Polski, which is Polish monthly newspaper, Nard, which is a pharmaceutical publication, National Corporation Reporter, National Culinary Progress for hotel chefs, National Dog Journal, National Drug Clerk, National Engineer, National Grocer, National Hotel Reporter, National Income Tax Magazine, National Jeweler, National Journal of Chiropractic, National Livestock Producer, National Miller, National Nut News, National Poultry, Butter and Egg Bulletin, National Provisioner for Meat Packers, National Real Estate Journal, National Retail Clothier, National Retail Lumber Dealer, National Safety News, National Spiritualist, National Underwriter, The Nation's Health, Nuevos, a Lithuanian newspaper, Newcomer, a Republican weekly for Italians magazine, Daily News, The New World, which is a Catholic weekly magazine, and really you only have to add one more word to the end of that publication's title for an interesting thing that people talk about nowadays. North American Banker, and the North American Veterinarian. The circulation of some of these publications is astonishing. The National Livestock Producer has a sworn circulation of 155,978. The National Engineer of over 20,000. The New World, an estimated circulation of 67,000. The greater number of the periodicals listed, chosen at random from among the 22,000, have a circulation of in excess of 10,000. The diversity of these publications is evident at a glance, yet they can only faintly suggest the multitude of cleavages that exist in our society, and along which flow information and opinion-carrying authority to the individual groups. Here are conventions which are scheduled for Cleveland, Ohio, recorded in a single recent issue of World Convention dates, a fraction of the 5,500 conventions and rallies which have been scheduled. So for that year, the Employing Photo Engravers Association of America, the Outdoor Writers Association, the Knights of St. John, the Walther League, the National Knitted Outwear Association, National Knitted Outwear. I was wondering if that could be rekindled with people that are knitting bikinis these days. The Knights of St. Joseph, the Royal Order of the Sphinx, which I think is kind of interesting. I'd like to look that up and see if that's still a thing. The Mortgage Bankers Association, the International Association of Public Employment Officials, the Kiwanis Club of Ohio, the American Photo Engravers Association, the Cleveland Auto Manufacturers Show, the American Society of Heating and Ventilating Engineers. Other conventions to be held in 1928 were of the Association of Limb Manufacturers Association, people who build prosthetics, the National Circus Fans Association of America, the American Naturopathic Association. So there was an association back in 1928 that was interested in naturopathic medicine, so herbs and natural cures. So I would suggest that that was one that, with the use of propaganda, was eventually staunched out. And it made a comeback in the 90s with kind of the New Age movement. I know because I have New Age aunt and uncle, and they got right into using herbs and sort of trying to fight back against the pharmaceutical industry. And so that's what a lot of herbal stores, including Nutters, kind of rose out of. Nutters didn't exist before that movement was rekindled and came back. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. There's good and bad things to do with that. The American Trap Shooting Association, the Texas Folklore Association, the Hotel Greeters, the Fox Breeders Association, the Insecticide and Disinfectant Association, the National Association of Egg Case and Egg Case Filler Manufacturers, the American Bottlers of Carbonated Beverages, and the National Pickle Packers Association, which I hope is still in existence today just because that is such a funny sounding name. Not to mention the Terrapin Derby, most of them with banquets and orations attached. If all of these thousands of formal organizations and institutions could be listed, and no complete list has ever been made, and nor will there be by this point, this is written then, but there's no way you could list everything today. Well, no, I don't think you could. They would still represent but a part of those existing less formally but leading vigorous lives. So, less formal groups and associations. I suppose you could say maybe Masons because it's not so formal, it's not out there in the public, and you might even be able to say like certain gangs are in a sense organizations too, but they aren't formal in the public, at least not to the point where you get to see all their inner workings. Ideas are sifted and opinions stereotyped in the neighborhood bridge club. So you can go to where you have your social hobby, and of course that becomes a place where ideas that you get from all of your other cleavages can come in and be discussed and perhaps spread, and maybe people join your group, etc. I'd say, although he talks about the bridge club, the most important one that goes on today is most likely the golf course. Leaders assert their authority through community drives and amateur theatricals. Thousands of women may unconsciously belong to a sorority which follows the fashions set by a single society leader. So, someone deep in the back of Cosmopolitan is deciding how Cosmo should be written and what women should care about, what they should wear, and that would be an invisible leader that doesn't exist. And they'll put all of the charismatic ones that you need to see on their cover, and they'll pay them happily because it makes money for them too to sort of spread their own propaganda around. Cosmo's full of all kinds of bad things these days. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody. Life magazine satirically expresses this idea in a reply which represents an American as giving to the Britisher, who praises this country for having no upper and lower classes or castes. So according to the Briton that doesn't exist, he sees his world, and then he sees the American world as not being that way. So the American responds, yeah, all we have is the 400, the white-collar men, bootleggers, Wall Street barons, criminals, the DAR, the KKK, the colonial dames, the Masons, Kiwanis and Rotarians, the KFC, which is the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization, the Elks Club, the Censors, the Consignetti, the Morons. I don't know if they meant to spell Mormons, and that was a typo that was left in. I don't know who the morons are, but okay. Heroes like Lindy, the WCTU, politicians, I don't know, maybe they did just mean morons, mechanites, the bourgeoisie, immigrants, broadcasters, and, oh yes, the rich and poor. Yet it must be remembered that these thousands of groups interlace. John Jones, which is kind of just a straw man he's using, besides being a Rotarian, is a member of a church, a fraternal order, of a political party, of a charitable organization, of a professional association, of a local chamber of commerce, of a league for or against prohibition, or of a society for or against lowering the tariff, or of a golf club. The opinions which he receives as a Rotarian will tend to disseminate in the other groups in which he may have influence. Which is what I was saying just a moment ago, that the influence from your group might have power to influence people in other groups as well. So it's a social kaleidoscope. This invisible intertwining structure of groupings and associations is the mechanism by which democracy has organized its group mind and simplified its mass thinking. To deplore the existence of such a mechanism is to ask for a society which has never was and never will be. So he doesn't believe that it's possible to have a society free of all these groups. To admit that it exists but expect that it shall not be used is unreasonable. And I suppose that he's probably right, actually, in that regard. There will always be people with ambitions and agendas, and so they will always have to form tribes in order to support that agenda and to move it forward. Emil Ludwig represents Napoleon as, quote, being ever on watch for indications of public opinion, always listening to the voice of the people, a voice which defies calculation. Do you know, he said in those days, it amazes me more than all else that the impotence of force to organize anything. The impotence of force to organize anything. So I don't even really know what much to make of that. There doesn't seem to be any ability of force to actually organize things. So organization of things might actually have more to do with the mind. So it's the importance of propaganda over bullets. You can influence people to do things far more with propaganda than you can with brute force. Brute force will eventually produce a rebellion, and you'll lose even more of what you thought you had. You just end up empty-handed when you're trying to control a group of people. So the impotence of force to organize anything. Although China, well, no, they still rely heavily on propaganda over force, actually. It is the purpose of this book to explain the structure of the mechanism which controls the public mind and to tell how it is manipulated by the special pleader who seeks to create public acceptance for a particular idea or commodity. It will attempt at the same time to find the due place in the modern democratic scheme for this new propaganda and to suggest its gradually evolving code of ethics and practice. So at this point, and probably always, he always assumed that he knew what was best and that if we could use propaganda to influence things for the better, then that would be a good thing. And I'd say that throughout his life, he did support at times things that were for the better of all society. So I believe when he supported President Wilson in World War I with creating a propaganda angle to make that war more popular. It was the war to end all wars and the war to preserve democracy is kind of the slogan that came up with. So if you believe in democracy being better than an authoritarian government that's absolute and has no movement like democracy does, or at least there is some movement, like the left is never in charge for too long, and that's something that we can see replete through history of democracies, is that there's always a shuffling back and forth between the left and the right. Except for in Canada right now, where we're having an issue with the one half of the country being way too different from the other half, and now there's interest in a split, and that's not new news because Quebec has tried to split 2 times in the past, and so now we're talking about a Western separatization thing too. So yeah, so there's a need for all that change, and maybe it is a good thing sometimes to have that. Definitely, democracy allows for more mobility anyway. So at any rate, that's what this book is going to be about. It's going to be about how things are controlled, how things are manipulated, and we'll look and see if we're being controlled or manipulated or not by any of the people that we subscribe to based on the information in this. So almost an hour now. That was quite a long session, I suppose, in a way. Hopefully you didn't mind it. I guess I'll just keep trying no matter what anyway. It's still kind of a new project, but I think it's interesting. It'll be interesting to people. Some people will just want to come and hang out and come listen. Maybe, like I say, pull up a seat, have a drink, and just listen for an hour. And we're a small enough group here now over on this channel that there's lots of room for discussions. And if there's anything I missed or I'm wrong on, then feel free to add it. Like we can have a pretty good community involvement right here. Where we can all learn and grow together. And if this ever gets too big, that won't really be able to happen, unfortunately. But I don't really see it getting too big anyway. We'll see what happens. But even if it only reaches a few people and opens their minds up to some things that they haven't considered before, that would be more than worth it. But I think that we can do a little bit more than that as we continue to use the professionals' advice through all of their books that we can freely go grab, and we can all come here and learn about the wire pullers of society and how they operate. And so yeah, so thanks for coming out, and yeah, peace out. See you next time. All right.